Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to our final Tea with a Trustee for 2021. My name is Judith Fish and I'm a professional accredited trustee with Untitled Trustees. And today, Paul and I are going to be discussing effective systems of governance and own risk assessments. This session will last around 30 minutes and will be recorded in case you'd like to rewatch it or share the recording with one of your colleagues who might be interested in the topic. We have some pre-submitted questions, which we'll be covering during today's session. But if you have any additional questions you'd like to ask, please do so. If you just add them to either the chat or the Q&A box, we'll pick them up and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Paul, who's going to introduce himself and the subject.
Good afternoon, everybody. Paul Tinslay of Dalriada, again, a professional accredited trustee, and also a member previously of the DWP Consultative Committee that transposed the EU legislation. That was IORP, which is Institutions for Occupational Retirement Provision. Rolls off the tongue. In our language, as it were, it's an occupational pension scheme. That legislation in terms of the governance certainly is everything which we've known and loved so far, plus, and the plus will depend upon really how good the governance structure currently is. But two important elements, really, that governance has to be evidenced to be effective. And they are two very key words within all of this. This is all to be supported by a code of practice, which is now to be introduced in the single code of practice expected in the summer. But as a trustee, I now find myself needing to do what I and the rest of the consultancy committee set out back in 2018. To use the legislation and the regulation really is the focus for improving governance and creating better member outcomes. Effectively, I've always felt, both at the time as a committee member and as a trustee now, that it's just a sensible way to run a pension scheme. You're on mute, Judith.
Schoolboy error, what can I say? I understand that the aim of these new requirements are to improve member outcomes, and everyone on this call, I'm sure, can get behind that sentiment. And I think in summary, we're required to have an effective system of governance, and that we'll have to demonstrate this. And as you say, the word evidence is key here. So Paul, what is an effective system of governance, or more commonly known of as ESOG?
Yes, ESOG, I love that, it's great. I think the way, certainly in my head, to understand it is just delete the E to begin with and just have the system of governance. A system of governance in anything really is the documentation, the processes and the procedures, which as trustees we already have lots of those in place. There are some pluses, which I mentioned earlier on. Contingency plans particularly is a good example of the pluses, to make sure that robust and effective contingency plans are actually in place. So looking at the documentation, the processes, the procedures that we already have, for example, we have business plans, we have budgets, we have trustee meetings, all of those kind of things are good governance processes and procedures. Add to that effective. You've then got to think about how do you prove that all of that is effective. A good example would be some stress testing, for example, and stress testing the systems of governance itself. A good example, and I know there's some of this in the marketplace at the moment, and some really good stuff actually, around cybersecurity, and actually going through, say, a simulated cybersecurity breach. That would be a good example of stress testing that particular part of the system of governance. And you can then determine how good it is and whether or not improvements need to be made. The analogy I use here, we've all been used to working in offices where every now and again the fire alarm will go off. So you have a process that you get up, you leave your desk, you leave everything else behind, apart from your cup of tea, obviously, tea with the trustee. And you obviously exit the building as quickly as possible. With cybersecurity, issue, you should have breach procedures in place, and it's a test as to how the trustees and the support services and advisors actually follow those breach procedures. So it's a good example about how that can work.
And can you summarize what you think the main points are?
I think the two main points from the beginning really are to understand that since 2019, January 2019, trustees have been required to do two things. Trustees must establish and operate an effective system of governance, the ESOG, as you said, which includes internal controls. They are not being thrown out of the window. They are incorporated within the effective system of governance. But all of that must be proportionate to the size, the nature, the scale, and the complexity of the activities of the occupational pension scheme. There are additional requirements for schemes that have more than 100 members, including documenting an assessment of the effectiveness of the system of governance, and that is effectively the ORA, the Own Risk Assessment.
Another beautiful acronym. So you mentioned 2019 there. Does that mean we've been falling foul of regulations and legislation already?
That is a good question. My feeling to that is yes and no. Yes, technically, but the legislation came into force when the statutory instrument was passed in January 2019. However, that legislation states that certain elements would not become effective until the regulator provided more information for the trustees in a code of practice. For very understandable reasons, including COVID, the regulator has not been able to do that. So that envisaged short delay period has just been extended, but for reasons which are very understandable. But that is the reason why we've got the two posts of the legislation is in place. The regulation has yet to be published, but which, as I said earlier on, we are expecting in the summer of 2022 in the single code.
Okay, so we're waiting for the new single code, and I do hope that when they do it, they provide some other documents alongside it, kind of examples of what they think a good ESOG and a good ORA might look like, and some more perhaps modules for trustees to go through in order to fulfill their duties. And I know that I sometimes struggle with some of the new acronyms, in particular ESOGs and ORAs, although I think I can get my mouth around those more easily than the effective system of governance, which I do find a bit of a mouthful, it has to be said. Okay, so from what you've said, for most trustee boards, this is about reinventing governance. We have governance in place already. So as you mentioned, we have business plans, we have risk registers, we have integrated risk management plans, we have a set processes of policies, and we know how we run our trustee meetings, etc. But the key difference will be that we'll need to ensure that everything is effective, make sure that there are no holes in there, and also then evidence our compliance with the ORA where that's needed. And for some schemes, there are a couple of other policies that will need to have in place as well. I understand things like remuneration policy, and I think you referenced continuity and contingency planning. And whilst they might be touched upon on the risk register at the moment, I think we're going to have to be a bit more detailed going forward. And I guess my summary is that to have an effective system of governance, we're going to need to have the right policies in place and the right procedures in place to ensure that we have good member outcomes. And then as part of this, we're also going to have to review them every 3 years. Now, I imagine that will be very similar to what we do at the moment. In our business plan, we'll have regular reviews of our policies and procedures. We just need to make sure that we capture everything when we're doing those. It seems like a lot of work, but I suspect that actually it won't be as bad as it seems on the surface. I guess the one piece that really is new is the Own Risk Assessment, the ORA. And that's in place for schemes with more than 100 members. And that's going to be a written assessment of how effective our policies are. I suspect that this is going to be quite a lot of work first time round. And I understand, and this isn't a once and done activity. The whole point of this process is that we have a system of governance that we can demonstrate and that we can evidence improvements in that gradually over time, so that we are ensuring that we have the best member outcomes possible. We've had a couple of questions in, and I wanted to turn to the first one of them, which is, what should trustees be doing now to prepare for these new requirements?
A very good question. One of the first steps. I think we've kind of touched on a couple of the first steps already, and certainly as a trustee, start to incorporate them in your 2022 trustee business plans and putting a budget around that. Budget, obviously, you need to have a bit of an idea about what you're going to do to determine what it's going to cost, I accept, but certainly start with the trustee business plan and identify what you do need to do and start to work out what budget you are going to need. I think having done those two things, the most sensible thing is what is now starting to be referred to as a gap analysis. So looking at the whole spectrum of a system of governance and what you have in the scheme. So effectively, as a trustee board, what should we have? What is missing, if anything? And what we've got, is it actually fit for purpose? And there's been some good developments I've seen in the marketplace already from support from advisors in actually helping trustee boards doing that. The thing to then think about is, having done that gap analysis, no matter how big your gap is, what you've actually got, is that actually effective? And how do you then think about evidencing that effectiveness? And that's where the advisors do need to actually step in and help trustee boards. I think that's where the value of the advice is going to be. Each scheme will have a gap. Some will be small, some will be a little bigger. And then you'll need to put a plan in place to improve the governance over time. So I think what trustees need to do as a minimum before the new code is published is actually analyse that gap, and at least you've got your starting point, really. However, evidencing the effectiveness is likely to be the area where most work, I think, is going to be required, where advice is going to be valuable. Remembering always that the system of governance must be proportionate. That's a specific requirement of the legislation. And therefore, each system of governance will tend to be bespoke and appropriate for your scheme.
I have to say that I've been certainly including ESOGs and the gap analysis in my 2022 business plans, and highlighting to employers that there is going to be a little extra work here, but we are actually going to need to spend some money to make sure we have the right systems of governance in place. But you've led me on perfectly to another question that we've been asked, which is, I know that the single code states that the ESOG should be proportionate to the size, nature, scale and complexity of the activities of the occupational pension scheme. But how do you determine proportionality? It's not defined in the single code. So can you give us any guidance here, Paul?
Thanks. I personally think, as a trustee, I don't want to be restricted by a particular definition. I think it's the trustee's view is what is appropriate for any particular scheme. What trustees are already doing a great deal of is great governance, as we said earlier on. And the main focus must be on better member outcomes. But what I would always want to avoid is disproportionate activity and related costs. I wouldn't want a framework or even a definition of even proportionality applied to a particular scheme, which you could then measure against another scheme and say, you must do this. I just don't feel that would be appropriate. And you wrote a blog on this recently, if I remember right.
Thank you, Paul. Yes. And I think there I was just reiterating what I've said before, is that many of the processes are in place. And actually, when you think about proportionality, we already have, we set business plans, we set budgets. So we're setting out in those documents what the trustees intend to do over the course of the scheme year. And then we have followed that up with our trustee meeting packs, minutes, action logs, etc., which kind of summarises what we have done and the advice we've received and the decisions we've made over the year. And then you have the trustee report and accounts, which in the trustee report section will summarise any key decisions that the trustees have made over the year. So I think we already kind of do that plan, do, and evidence. We already have that kind of process set out. Now, the trustee report perhaps is a little bit thin on the ground in terms of what we actually achieve, but we do have the plan, the plan, do, and evidence set up already in place. And I think that's probably a great start for one's ESOG, and pragmatically applies proportionality. I guess in addition, where you have professional trustees on board and you have your advisors between us, we will see what's going on a range of other schemes, and that will also give us a level of comfort as what's proportionate to our scheme, given its size and complexity. And I think complexity is a really key factor here. I think you were going to talk a little bit more about proportionality, perhaps when we're not trying to understand kind of the minimum of what we need to do, I guess, in order to comply with the requirements.
Yeah, my view is proportionality is what's appropriate for a scheme, and that can be dialing up proportionality as well as dialing down. It's not just a one-way street. If we look at the statutory instrument, for example, schemes with 100 members or more are required to have an internal evaluation function. It's one of the 3 introduced functions. IOP 2, interestingly, actually required an internal audit. However, with due credit to the DWP, this was transposed into law as an internal evaluation, deliberately diluting the internal audit, which will ultimately, we believe, reduce the costs for UK pension schemes. However, for the very largest of the UK pension schemes, a proportionate approach to the internal evaluation may well be an internal audit every year, possibly from, say, mid-sized and mid-complex schemes once every 3 years, and in the intervening years actually have a lower internal evaluation. And that, in my mind, was proportionality. Applying it sometimes is dialing up the proportionality as well as dialing down.
Okay, we've had another question that kind of fits in with this, with what I was going to say, which is, who's going to know if we don't do this? And is this simply just going to be another tick box on the scheme return? And I think the question we've had in has been, what are the consequences of non-compliance, and are there any fines?
Yeah, a very good question. I haven't seen that the regulator has said that it actually wants to see an ORA at this stage, but I do think it would be logical to actually append it to a scheme return, or particularly if the regulator had any other reason to investigate a scheme. I kind of feel that it's one of the first things the regulator may ask for into the future. We need to investigate the scheme. Okay, let's get the last 1 or 2 own risk assessments, and then you get a very quick picture as to how the scheme has actually been operating. Possibly a little more seriously, particularly for DB schemes here, trustees, I think, potentially also risk the implications of the Pension Schemes Act 21 and the regulator's new powers. An early conversation I actually had with a couple of legal advisors independently, and we kind of got around to agreeing that not having an effective system of governance is potentially conduct risking accrued scheme benefits, which, as we all know, is a criminal offence under the Act itself.
Yeah, that's a bit scary, and I know I wouldn't want to take that risk. What are the other advantages potentially of having an ORA and an ESOG in place?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few, actually. One I think is, and I felt at the time, and still do now as a trustee, there's very much a potential commercial aspect to the ORA, and it will have a value. Say, for example, you've got a business with a DB scheme, and the owners of the business want to sell for whatever reason that might be. Certainly, if I was the potential acquirer, I would ask to see the last own risk assessment, or 2 or 3. We could have access to, FRS 102, and if the trustees permit, the trustee valuations over time. That gives you the numbers, but actually seeing a copy of the own risk assessment and more over time actually gives you far more of an insight as to how effectively the trustees have been running the pension scheme and the proverbial skeletons in the cupboard. So I think it could well have an impact on the value of a business if the trustees haven't produced them, or maybe not necessarily done them in the way that they should be. Yeah,
no, I can see that. And I can also see that they'll be of interest to the employer. they want to make sure the scheme's being run and that there are good member outcomes, because it's an important part of their employees or former employees' benefits. So, and I can also see that members will be interested in the ORA and the ESOG, and I wonder to what extent that we'll end up reporting to our members, improvements in our governance over time, so that they can have the confidence that schemes are being run. I think there is still a lack of, to a certain extent, a lack of trust around pensions, more in the wider public. Okay, so I was really going to go on to another question that we've received, which was, does the ORA really need to be redone each year? TPR thinks so, but legislation suggests only every 3 years. And I think the answer to that question is, we agree. Legislation sets out that the ORA needs to be carried out not less frequently than every 3 years, and that the draft single code refers to annually. So there is a difference there. I think our understanding is that some industry responsive have pushed back on that, particularly for smaller schemes where doing an ORA annually would be quite a lot of work. So I guess that is one area where we might see a change in the final single code when it comes out. And I do wonder whether we'll end up with a similar arrangement to pension scheme valuations, where we do a full valuation every 3 years, and then in the intervening years we do a kind of lighter touch actuarial report. So we might find that we have the same kind of setup going forward with the ORA. But I do agree, there at the moment there is a disconnect between legislation and what's in the single code, and I guess only time will tell which one wins out. Do you have any views on frequency, Paul?
Yeah, that is a difficult one. I'm not going to say that one's easy, and it's a bit of a challenge for the regulator as well, to be fair to them. When in the consultative committee, I felt schemes needed to demonstrate continued improvements in the governance over time, and you will actually see an element of that within the statutory instrument itself, that trustees do need to demonstrate that. Some commentators have referred to the own risk assessment as being similar to an MOT. I don't actually see it that way. As I understand it, if you fail an MOT, you are not actually allowed to drive your vehicle on the open highway. You can't fail an own risk assessment. It is an assessment of where you are. The important thing is to integrate the results of that into your scheme management and decision-making process and create those improvements over time. So regular own risk assessments will then record how that improvement is going on. The question then is how regularly that needs to be done. And maybe there's an argument here that some proportionality would be appropriate, rather than definitively saying up to you within 3 years, in which case many trustees might go for just 3 years. Or annually. Maybe there is a more pragmatic approach to this, but I think the important thing is to have a reasonably regular measurement which can demonstrate that you are improving your governance over time. Yes.
Yeah, I guess the thing is we mustn't forget what the aim of this is, which is to improve governance of occupational schemes and other schemes with other kind of governing structures, and to ensure better member outcomes. Okay, so we have another question submitted, which is, how does the ORA interact with the risk register?
Yeah, the risk register is part of the internal controls. The internal controls is part of the system of governance, the ESOG, effective system of governance. And the ORA, the own risk assessment, is an assessment of that system of governance. So I think that the risk registers will need to be updated, recording some of the additional parts as required in the statutory instrument, such as contingency plans for the continuity, and so on and so forth. So if I take an example of that, schemes with very good current in-house pensions managers or scheme secretaries would typically be assessed as a key person risk in terms of the operation and the continuity of the pension scheme. If those people do not have teams around them, and many of them don't, the risk is even more severe. They're a single person risk. So what is the contingency plan around that key person or that single person? And how do you prove that contingency plan would be effective if ever it is needed to be relied upon? And so what evidence do you have in place to confirm that it would be effective? So risk register, very much part of the internal controls. Own risk assessment is the assessment of the entire system of governance. So as trustees, the first thing to do for the own risk assessment is to actually set out how you are going to assess the effectiveness of the risk management system. And this will actually include an assessment of the risk register itself. So how often is the risk register reviewed? How often is it updated? And actually, importantly, who is involved in the risk management function?
And that's a good question on the who, because I note that the statutory instrument talks about trustees needing to prevent conflicts rather than manage, which is quite a different stance from where we are at the moment, where we've been managing conflicts within trustee boards and with the employer, etc. So, are you able to expand on that at all?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The statutory instrument does state prevention rather than management around the three key functions. So the three key functions apply to schemes with 100 members or more. And they, as a reminder, are the internal evaluation, the actuarial function, and the risk management function. Thinking back to my days as part of the consultation, I did feel, and still do, that this interacted with some other aspects of the statutory instrument. We had, I felt, appropriately diluted the internal audit function to an internal evaluation function in the UK law. That was to incorporate cost control. We established that proportionality must be applied, allowing trustees to create an effective system of governance specific to their scheme. However, I certainly felt it was important to avoid this becoming, as you said, a kind of a tick box exercise, and have some form of independence to the evaluation, pardon me, which is the own risk assessment, particularly, especially as I mentioned earlier on, if the own risk assessment has other aspects to it, such as having a commercial value. The requirement in the statutory instrument, as you say, is for trustees to prevent the conflicts of interest. I don't think it necessarily precludes in-house pensions managers and those on the payroll from being involved. Obviously, to recuse oneself from the action itself is a way of preventing the conflict, but the trustees need to take the responsibility to make sure the conflict is prevented. And just stepping out may be the answer, may not be the answer in any particular scheme circumstances, and that I think is quite an important point. Yeah.
I know we're beginning to run out of time, so I'll just I think the last point really is, what are the key outcomes of the new requirements? I mean, I feel like a lot's being asked of trustees. You've got the new single code, the new TPR powers. How do you think this is going to change the way pension schemes are run? Do you see more trustees stepping down, etc.?
I think it's unfortunate, but I do, as trustees, I think there will be a requirement for more professionalism within it, and that's more independent trustees. That's also the use of third-party pensions management support. Particularly, they come with their own contingency plan built in, those that are not on the employer's payroll, so don't have that issue with regards to preventing the conflicts of interest. So there's lots of logical reasons why these would be included. I think the development and trend towards sole trusteeship here is a logical choice. I would hope, and I find it as a trustee very, very beneficial, where you have the ex-trustee board then create a pensions committee to help you. As the sole trustee, you have the legal and regulatory responsibilities, which the pensions committee don't, but then you don't lose all of that historical knowledge of the culture of the business and the scheme and those kind of things. I do also think that it's likely to lead to more consolidation.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We're coming to the end of today's session, so just key takeaways are, I think my first one would be, don't panic. We already have systems of governance in place. We have policies, we have procedures, etc. So we might need to refine them, but it's not starting from scratch. I think that whilst you can't delegate everything to advisors, it's just important to have an action plan in place and see, make sure you know who's doing what in terms of pulling all your documentation together, etc. Whilst there are no automatic requirements for TPR to ask to see a copy of your ESOG and ORA, they might do, so just be prepared, I guess. And to achieve the aim of improving member outcomes, this has to be a gradual process of improving governance for schemes. So no matter how good your governance is, there's always room for improvement. And I think that that's what we need to remember when completing our ESOGs and, if required, our ORAs. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope we'll see you in the new year with our next series of Tea with the Trustees. Goodbye.
Goodbye.